Hey everyone, welcome to Hot Thoughts Live. We are on what is volume 10 of this fun experiment that started 10 weeks ago, where we gathered faith and thought leaders from across the country to chat about life, faith, culture, and the intersection of all of those things, all while eating spicy wings, which I think adds a fun little element to what we're doing. And so as we kind of prepare to get going, we'll let people gather as we usually do. But before we dive into just kind of meeting each other, I just want to know how you're doing. And so, Kim, you're the one that I work the closest to. So kind of what's new in your life? What's going on? How you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm enjoying summer. I got to spend some time away from work, which was the first time in a really long time to do that. So I totally unplugged and enjoyed that, and enjoying summer time, which is probably my favorite season of the year, as much as I can. So having a good time.
Yeah, summer is by far my least favorite season because it's hot. And Nancy, you said it's like really, really hot where you are. So I mean, how are you? How are you hanging in there? What's new? How are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm in the Chicago area, so I would imagine that it's even hotter south of here. But we're going to escape next week to Colorado, and I checked the high temperatures and low temperatures for next week, and it's going to be a low of 46 at night. Wow. And a high of like 72, which will be about 20 degrees or more cooler. So yay, be great.
And like no humidity, I imagine. That's right. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jenna, you're probably in like, I imagine Atlanta's hotter than all this. So what's it like for you?
It's hot here. So today I actually did my first funeral in COVID. And so we were outside the whole time. And because I was missing like being in vestments and all that, I put on all my stuff, and like 10 seconds in, I was like, oh, this was a mistake. I was sweating. So it's super hot here. But yeah, I'm hoping to get to the beach in about a week and a half. So it'll still be hot, but at least it'll be hot on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, the heat is inescapable, both in our climate and tonight, because it's going to be super spicy in the wings we have. So as we kind of dive in, it looks like we've kind of reached our critical mass. And so why don't we dive into just a chance to get to know our guests. And so these are some folks that I'm really excited to dive into. If you haven't seen, our topic is story and storytelling, which we'll get a little more into because it may be a vague topic, but excited to dive into, and I think meaningful for those that are leading the church, those that are like just a part of the church, and those that are outside of it, like as we talk about how we do that. Before we get into wings and topics, why don't we introduce ourselves? And Kim, why don't we start with you?
Great. Hi, I'm Kim Jenne. I currently serve as Director of Connectional Ministries for the Missouri Conference of the United Methodist Church, which means that I don't currently serve a local church as pastor, even though I'm ordained. I work with a regional body of the United Methodist Church, and I'm based in Columbia, Missouri, which is in the middle of the state and the home of the University of Missouri, which I did not attend. So I feel like a little bit like an outsider there. But in my role for the Missouri Conference, I get to work with local churches, help equip and resource pastors and lay leaders in a lot of different areas. And the past several months has been kind of consumed, as most of our lives have been, around our pandemic, around the justice issues that have kind of been uncovered even more so through the course of the pandemic. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time. And so I don't preach on a regular basis, so I guest preach, which has really changed my understanding of how storytelling works with the role of preacher. And so we might get to that a little bit later.
Yeah, that's awesome. Nancy, what about you?
Well, I serve most of the time as a leadership coach with the Slingshot group, and our goal is to help everybody flourish in every area of their lives. So I do individual coaching and then some team coaching. My church attachment is a church called Soul City Church in Chicago, and I'm one of the teaching pastors there, so I occasionally bring the message on the weekend, and sometimes in other places like Kim. Sometimes I'm the guest teacher. In my former church, I was a teaching pastor and taught more regularly than I get to do now. And I have two daughters, two adult daughters, and a son-in-law as well.
Awesome. And Jenna, what about you?
I'm an Episcopal priest in a parish. I'm the associate rector at Holy Trinity Parish in Decatur, Georgia. I've been there about 8 years. So unlike Kim and Nancy, same as y'all were saying, it changes my understanding of how story functions in preaching, but maybe to a different degree or in a different way. So
yeah. Well, awesome. So we'll dive into some of those questions and even talking about story here in just a moment. And before we do, what we will do, as we always do, is kind of introduce our first sauce, and then we'll get ready to dive into question number one. And my first sauce, I actually got it at a restaurant just the other day. I do a lot of like carry out, and on their carry out menu they had hot sauce, and so it's Hank's, and I had never tried it. And I've been putting it on my food all week. It's like better than Frank's Red Hot, which is maybe why they call it Hank's. It's like a rip off of that. I don't know, but it's pretty delicious. So, Kim, what about you?
So my first sauce is a kind of an oldie but a goodie. I call it my pocket hot sauce. So because I have put it in my purse and taken it to restaurants because it's a pretty easy one, but it makes everything a little bit better. So Louisiana hot sauce.
All right.
Well, I don't know whether to call myself a hot sauce wimp or a hot sauce rookie, but this is not in my world whatsoever. My son-in-law loves hot sauce, so he advised me on all this. And I ended up just going to Buffalo Wild Wings, and I looked at their list and their range, and I started very low. So my first one is just a simple teriyaki. I love that taste, and we will work our way up from there.
Yeah, I dig it. Buffalo Wild Wings, underrated sauces. So, Jenna, what do you got?
So Nancy, I'm like you. I just went for a straight lineup. My hot sauce taste is very basic, so I just went to Hattie B's, which is a hot chicken place, and I'm going to work my way up the ladder with one brief break-in. So I'm starting with mild from Hattie B's. Perfect.
All right. Well, so I'll throw the question up, and the question is this, and as you read it, please take a bite of your first swing, and then we'll have Kim, you'll dive in first for us. But the question is this, kind of why is storytelling so important? And storytelling can be such a myriad of things, from preaching to just being able to be in front of a small group of people and cast some vision. And so as we think about it from your perspective, and even think about it from perspectives of people outside of your own role, why would you say, just as a whole, that the art of storytelling is so important?
I think storytelling is so deeply human. I think it's probably one of the first things that human beings began to do, and especially as people of faith on this call, like, it's such a part of who our tradition is, right? The oral tradition that came to us through story. But there's something about story that is able to tap into kind of the sense of magic, a sense of awe and wonder that really connects. I think it doesn't matter how old you are, it taps into kind of that childlike sense of mystery. And it's just, I think it's just something that is so a part of who we are, the fabric of humanity, capturing our imagination, tapping into that creativity. The fact that these brains of ours have the ability to like create such amazing visuals, right? As someone else tells us the story, I think it's just deeply central to who we are as a people. I don't know any culture that doesn't have story as a central part of who they are.
Yeah. Great. Well, Nancy, before you dive in, just to let you know, you are someone's hero. And so that was just thrown out there. But as you think about storytelling, why do you think it's so important? Oh, hold on a second. You're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
People hate that, don't they? I saw that like a joke on Zoom, and here I am doing it. Okay, so once upon a time, I think, are four of the most magical words a person can hear. And I think storytelling is important because we remember them. We remember a story more than anything else, more than dogmatic teaching or somebody's 3 points or whatever. Sometimes we don't even know what the point was, but we remember the story. And I think it's the most powerful form of communication.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as a preacher who preaches pretty frequently, I know that like most people don't remember the things I said, but they can tell me the stories that I wove into things, right? Like those have much more stickiness. So Yeah, Jenna, what about for you when you think about that?
So just to build on that, one of my preaching mentors once told me, never open with the story because that's all they'll remember. Start with the text, because if you start with the story, they're not going to hear anything after that. And I think there's truth to it. I should have looked it up before we started who said it, but this notion of human beings as homo neurons, right? That we're humans of story, people of story. So in addition to everything Kim and Nancy said, I always think about Jesus too as storyteller, right? Jesus didn't say, God loves you, God forgives you, God's always willing to welcome you home. He said, there was a man who had 2 sons and told a story. So I think there's a way that stories help us connect to ideas and to one another that other kinds of discourse just don't do as well.
Yeah. No, it's really good. And I think I have never thought about the fact that you just said that. Like Jesus, I just did a series on the parables, and that hasn't crossed my mind that Jesus doesn't usually dive into that, but dives straight into let me tell you a story about these people. And I think does really point to, I think exactly what the 3 you're saying, story is central, even in the Son of God, right? Being able to talk to people about the truths and the character of God started with story.
It lets meaning be more layered, I think, rather than sort of a straight lesson. When you tell a story, there's so many different ways to, especially with the parables, there's so many different ways to interpret and make meaning and layer them that it lets the poetry of a story sing in a way that a lesson maybe doesn't. It's the clarity.
And we call Jesus the Word, right? And so Christ's self is the story, which I think is it's beautiful. That's the central story that permeates all stories after it. And that's such a cool thing.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you guys for sharing that and kind of kicking us off, because I think as we talk about storytelling, if I was tuning in, I'd be like, well, I think that's great, but why would I tune in if is it important? Is it not important? I think just the 3 unique perspectives on laying the groundwork, I think help us understand why then storytelling, in whatever form it looks like, is actually important, but especially from this faith component. And so the next question actually kind of builds on that a little bit, but we will quickly move to our next thoughts as we prepare to go with that. And so I'm actually really excited about this one. So I met a guy in October, which not only because of the calendar, but because of the pandemic feels like at least 17 years ago. But he started, so it's RFH Peppers, which stands for Really Freaking Hot, which I found out, and I think is a great title, actually. He was nervous about it being on a church podcast. I said, you're going to be fine. But it's RFH Peppers, and he makes these sauces, and he's in my community. It's really, really great, really tasty. He actually has more than half of my sauce lineup tonight, but this one is their signature. And so you can find them on Facebook, but it's really good. And so, Kim, what do you have?
Right. So my second sauce is the 314 hot sauce, which I've never had before. It's a St. Louis sauce, I guess, and I've spent most of my adult life living in St. Louis, so I kind of still orient myself to the east side of the state. So yeah.
Awesome.
I'm going with a honey barbecue.
All right, I'll dig it.
Yeah.
Jenna?
So here's my little interloper in Hattie B's. I was wandering around in the church kitchen today and found this very artisanal, unique hot sauce, Taco Bell Fire. So we're going to go with that this round.
That's great. Artisanal would be the word I would use to describe that. That's outstanding.
Really highbrow.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the craft beer of hot sauces. So as we talk about why the art of storytelling is important, I'd be interested to hear from each of your perspective, what then makes a compelling story? Because I think we've all sat through poor storytelling and stories that don't connect for a number of reasons. And we could get into the negative, but I think we bend towards negative really easily. And so maybe what on the positive side and the affirming side, what makes a compelling story or storyteller from your perspective?
First of all, I'm going to say the 314 disappoints me. St. Louis
is it not spicy enough? What are you thinking?
It's not remotely hot at all. So
oh no,
I'm disappointed. Anyway, so I think what makes a compelling storyteller is someone that has truly lived in a story for some time. So I think that my favorite writers that are storytellers, it took them years to write a book. They like immersed themselves into worlds. They really got to know the characters. They let those words and the character speeches roll around in their mouth for years. And I mean, we make the joke that kind of like the fish story, like fish tales, like the fisherman, every time you tell that story, the fish gets bigger. Well, I think there's something to be said about stories that you live. And when I think about storytellers in my family, right, that there are these repeat stories that you love to hear because you find a new angle for them, you find a new truth. And so I think what makes a compelling storyteller is someone who's kind of lived into it for some time. And the best preachers I've heard are the ones who have really lived out the stories of Scripture for and spend time wrestling with those stories so that they can kind of tell it backwards and forwards, so it doesn't feel like something that they just picked up a week before they preached a sermon and read this story for the first time, but they've actually kind of walked in the character's shoes. They've really investigated and wrestled with it. So that's what makes a compelling storyteller to me, is someone who's lived into it for some time. And I think compelling stories in general are ones that connect with some deep human truth, right? That really, and I think a lot of times, I know I'm guilty of this. I try to do too much with a story, and really you just have to pinpoint one particular truth. And to me, that's what makes the most compelling stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think compelling storytellers also, it's a skill that they develop over time, but they know how much detail to include to paint a picture and how much detail is extraneous and you don't really need. And then there's something really amazing about the timing of a good storyteller. Like if you watch a good comic, they're telling stories usually, and their timing is impeccable. And then a good story usually has some element of either conflict or surprise, I think. There's got to be something that has you on the edge of your seat, not knowing what to expect, and it either takes a twist or a turn, or there's a big payoff somewhere at the end. Maybe it's something really funny at the end or something very moving, but you maybe didn't see it coming. And so it is an art, and I am in awe of really good storytellers. When I watch someone who's mastered this, I try to think, how did they do that? And, kind of pick it apart and try to learn from it.
Yeah, I tell people all the time that pastors are like the combination of historical stand-up comedians and motivational speakers. Like there is an interesting combination between those. So yeah. But Jenna, what about you? I mean, you think about a compelling storyteller. What do you get?
Oh, now there's two things. So the first thing I totally agree with Kim and Nancy. The first word that came to mind for what makes a compelling storyteller to me was a good editor. Like Kim said, kind of choosing what details go in. Nancy said enough to paint a picture. So like when I kind of hear a story that's not just told but crafted, that's what I respond to. I think for myself, it's why I'm a better storyteller. Like when I'm preaching, when I write it down and have the time to sort of shape it, rather than when I'm sitting around with friends and I'll kind of go off on a tangent. I'm not a terribly compelling storyteller in those cases. The other piece, Danny, responding to what you just said about sort of pastors in particular, I think pastors are also interpreters of stories in a way. That's a different skill, perhaps, but also a compelling storyteller. There's something different about crafting my own narrative, maybe, than about taking these stories that we've inherited and not translating them, but interpreting them for your particular context, for your particular audience. But it's a different skill, but it requires a similar kind of editing eye, I think. And when you hear a preacher do that really well, like Kim said, someone who sort of inhabits the story, like that's the skill I want. That's what I want to learn how to do well.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't know that I would have thought about that idea of like editor, but like being able to, I think there is like this gift of being able to be able to find what's the most pithy part of the story, whether it's scripture or the story you're telling, and cut out. I mean, like, and this maybe sounds sacrilegious, but like I always try to figure out like how I can not read the entire 30-verse scripture that I want to preach, so that I can get to the most pithy part of it, right? And then also then weave a story in and make them like almost seamless. But I would say like on the side of the not compelling storyteller, it's where the scripture, which is really compelling on its own, or like the story, which is really compelling on its own, has no personal connection to the person telling it. It's just like I'm representing or repurposing this thing that was really like maybe I cared about, but I have no real ability to make it matter for me and then to you. Yeah. Well, so and so I don't know if you saw this comment actually. So the comment that just popped up, someone said they were hoping to hear 4 good stories tonight, and so perhaps we'll have a little storytelling moment during our Q&A. And that is my fair warning to tell you that that might come later. So be prepared. So, but it wasn't on the questions I sent you in a week in advance. So I'm sorry about that.
I just told y'all I like a minute to write it down. So
yeah. Mentally write it down. It'll be great. And so as we prepare for our next question, just quickly again, an interdiction of our sauces. And this one is called the Widowmaker, which is like just a brutal. It's not that tasty, but it's the one that I'm eating the slowest, and I had to start rotating it into the lineup, and so it's pretty hot. So, Kim, what do you have?
I have Los Calientes, which is a hot ones sauce. I watch that show on YouTube. I don't know if anybody else does, which is a similar hot wings show, and this is apparently theirs, which I've not had before.
Yeah, it's I've heard great things about it, so I'm excited.
I like the color of it. It's a different color than all of my other ones. So
yeah, tell me what you think about it, because it might be on my list of ones to buy. So Nancy, what do you have?
I have the very exciting sauce called medium. So
medium.
And
I like that.
It's a weird color. I don't know if you can see it. It's like it's like pinky orange. It's scaring me a little bit, but we're gonna try.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. Jenna, what do you have?
Nancy, I also have medium of a different sort. So
that's really good. Oh, sorry. I tried not to snort on any episode, so I'm apologize for doing that. But
it's pretty snort worthy.
Yeah, let's take a bite and then we'll dive into our next question, which is this. So we talked about why it's important, what makes a compelling storyteller, but I wonder, do you see the value? And we kind of touched on this a little bit, but when you think about weaving your own story, where do you see the value? Maybe where do you see the lack of value in a practical sense? But when you think about weaving my story, because I have a lot of own personal experience, baggage, X, Y, or Z thing that I bring into any story I tell, how do you see that kind of working itself out? So Kim, we'll start with you.
I do see value in it. I think it's one of the hardest things that preachers do, and I think it's laced with danger, caution. I don't know. I kind of changed my opinion on this back and forth, I think, on different things, and I'm really curious to hear what my colleagues have to say about this, because I think we come out of slightly different traditions around the role of kind of the personal story in preaching specifically. But I know, Danny, I think you were talking more about, it doesn't just have to be about like the sermon itself, but in other aspects of how we see it. Right. So I do see value in it. I think that the primary job of the preacher as storyteller is to tell the story of the good news of Jesus Christ, to tell the story that the kingdom is at hand, it's available to everyone right here, right now. I think that's our job. And if you can tell a personal story, if you can weave your personal experience into conveying that story so that people feel a deeper sense of connection and are pointed toward that story, that's fantastic. I wonder sometimes that we don't necessarily get that right. and we actually end up pointing the people toward ourselves. I think the congregation, the audience, I think they usually love that stuff. Jenna, I think you're totally right about leading with a story. I don't know how many sermons that I sweat blood, working on and thinking it was like a really amazing. And that one little funny story that I told about my family's Thanksgiving dinner was all anyone ever remembered, right? And they kind of missed the gospel message for the sake of the kind of the funny. And so I think that's the challenge that we all face. I have known some brilliant preachers who are able to weave their personal story, who are able to show their own history, their own vulnerability, be really transparent, and at the same time have such a humble spirit that what you see in that is actually Jesus and not the person. I think that is an amazing, amazing gift to be able to do that. I have a lot to learn in that area. And I think that what I struggle with and wrestle with is ego, the role of ego, because I want the laugh, right? Like I want people to like me. And I know the most vulnerable sermons and teachings that I've ever given, people really seem to deeply connect with that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've always been able in those moments to really open the door to God in that versus open the door to me. Now, I think with teaching and as a pastor, you're trying to build pastoral trust. You're trying to build relationships and through your personal story, that's how they get to know you. That's how they get to trust you, so that maybe you can have those harder conversations that lead to transformation, that lead to spiritual formation. It's just, I think it's a hard thing. And I think with our consumeristic culture, it's becoming a harder and harder exercise for pastors to not just provide the entertainment, to provide the show. And there's a lot of competition out there that is doing they're doing some amazing things, some of which I think actually maybe points to the gospel better than, we do in the church, whether it be literature, movies, different types
of whatever it might be.
Hot sauce, exactly, when you're begging for mercy. So, I think it definitely shows. I think it definitely has value. I also think there's a gender thing that I hope we get to, because I think how women preachers share personal story is often interpreted differently than how men share their personal stories. And that's something that maybe we can put on a parking lot and get back to, because I want to hear what Nancy and Jenna have to say about the value.
Yeah, I would love to dive into that, mostly because I can't speak to it. So I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this. But Nancy, why don't we let's keep with this one, but maybe when we get to the Q&A section, we'll start with that one, because I would love to talk about that.
I've seen two extremes, and we probably all have. I really appreciate what you just said, Kim, because I think one extreme, my sister went to a church for a long time where the pastor never told a personal story, ever. And no one knew anything about this man's life outside of the pulpit. And he thought that it was professional, to do that. And so he might quote something else or tell you something from history, but he's never going to tell you anything about himself. That was all buttoned up. And then the other extreme is at least as bad, if not worse, where it's all about the person. I mean, the pulpit, in my view, attracts narcissists. And I know that I'm not above this, where, you're so endearing to the people that they feel like they know you completely. And you may never have even had coffee with them, but they think they know you because you're just ripping your heart open every Sunday, telling them, about your life. And oversharing sometimes. And also we have a way, I've done this, where we tell a story that it looks like you're being so humble, but you actually find a way to be the hero, in the story, if you're not careful. So I think there's some real danger. On the other hand, when I think of sermons that have most moved me, it is the stories and the fact that I felt a connection to that person. One more thing, I think when you're laying out a challenge of any kind, people wonder, well, are you working on this? Have you struggled with this? Have you had anything you can teach us from your own life? And so I think there's a curiosity, like, and hopefully you're not always slam dunking. I did this week and it was a great success, but it's more about, identifying with the struggle.
Yeah, that's good. Jenna, what about you?
So I'll say that I absolutely see value in it. I absolutely see value in using story in preaching and teaching and speaking. And I'm also, I feel myself pretty reticent to do it. And I think for a lot of the reasons that Kim and Nancy named, I know that for me, the question is similar to what Kim was saying. The question is, for me, if I'm going to tell a story, is this a story in which God is the subject of the sentence, right? It might be about me. It might be about how God is at work in my life, or, but the question is, like, who's the actor in this? And that sometimes for me is a good check, a good balance. I have tried in my own preaching to be a little more disclosing because it's not my natural posture. And, so right now, I'm in the Episcopal Church, so we're using the Revised Common Lectionary on Sundays and in the daily office. And both of those, we're currently reading through Romans. Everybody knows Romans, right? There's such a difference when I read Romans as sort of this Paul writing doctrine versus Paul writing his own story and working out his struggle with Israel's salvation. And like, this is personal to him. What about his people, right? So I use that as a kind of measure of, like, if I'm doing it, not like St. Paul, but if I'm doing that same thing, right? Kind of using my own life experience to wrestle with the gospel versus, oh, here's a story about sheep. Let me tell you about that time I went to Spain and saw a shepherd, right? Like, we've all heard sort of those variations in preaching. So, and I've heard a lot of the latter, and I think sometimes that's why I'm reticent to really discern and check myself before I tell a story in the pulpit. But there's value in it for all the reasons y'all named. Connection. People can hear better, I think, when they feel a connection to you. It's just.
I would also add that I think that the role of personal story doesn't solely have to reside within the preaching moment, within the sermon, right? And I know both of the women on this episode are very gifted storytellers when it comes to the liturgy, the worship arc, the story that you're trying to tell over a season in the life of the church, over the course of the rhythm for a particular worship service. I mean, both are really gifted in that. I think sometimes we forget that the church's liturgy, the church's story is also an opportunity to weave in kind of who you are, who the people of this particular community are, whether it be through prayers, through the sacrament of Holy Communion or baptism. And I think that's sometimes missed. So,
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are tools for storytelling that we really haven't touched on. So it's not just the person in the pulpit, but I like to leverage a wider use of the arts. And so that could be imagery on the screen. That could be, I was teaching and I found this very fun little episode on YouTube that was a teacher and how he greets his students every day with an individual handshake. Maybe you saw that. And I was teaching about how God says yes to us personally in a very unique way. And that's what this teacher was doing with these kids. So you cut to that for 3 minutes. And it's just, for one thing, it helps with people's attention, not listening to someone talking with nothing visual or nothing supporting it. My daughter writes monologues and spoken word pieces, and sometimes I'll be teaching and then I'll just cut away to her doing that. And so I think we just need to leverage a wider array. I think of it as a toolbox, and what's in your toolbox that you can use as a communicator beyond just the words.
I think the other piece in thinking about non-preaching ways to utilize story or other, like for me, a big part of my work in formation especially is helping folks, facilitating folks being able to connect their own stories to God and to God's work and to God's salvation. And so, there's a way I think that it's not just about me using my stories as the pastor or telling the salvation narrative stories, but helping folks kind of think of their own lives as story, helping to create kind of narratives out of these moments and think about how those connect to sacred scripture, how they connect to this bigger arc that we're talking about. Of redemption. And those are some of the most, I think, for me, profound moments as a pastor, is to help folks make those connections. So I think helping our the souls entrusted to our care, whether we're in a parish or a conference or in our coaching, whatever it is, to help people recognize their own stories as connected to God's story, as a part of God's story.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah. Thank you guys for sharing. I mean, that's all, like, I feel like I learned more stuff here than I have in the history of Hot Thoughts, just like on the idea of like storytelling. So I appreciate you guys taking me down that road. And so selfishly, just for me. And so I would say we're going to prepare for our section, which is heading into kind of our audience participation point. So if you have a question, we would ask you to drop it in the comments. This is your chance to ask Kim, Nancy, Jenna, anything that you want that you think would be like, it could be whatever. And so throw it in there. They're more than happy to answer that. But as we kind of let them kind of fall in, and sometimes we get no questions, so I'll give you guys full disclosure. But as we let them come in, here's what I'll ask you guys to do. Kim, why don't you rephrase the question you asked earlier? And I would love the three of you just to dialogue a little bit about that. And what we'll do is when we get our first question, we'll go into our wing and our sauce or whatever you have. But why don't you dive into that topic that you were just saying, kind of about the difference in gender roles. And so if you would just kind of rephrase the question for anyone that's just tuning in, and then we'll dive into it.
Sure. And I don't know if Jenna and Nancy would agree with me on this, but I know that in my experience, I sometimes see the way women use story to be interpreted by the audience differently than if a man tells a story. And I'll give you an example. I think it's very popular right now to be very vulnerable in your preaching, to do some act of confession, some type of reveal of a previous, whether it's an addiction or something that you're struggling with. And I've seen lots of male preachers, lots of men share that. And it is often received as the greatest thing.
Yes.
So brave. And I would agree that it is brave to be vulnerable. Yeah. It's not that. Whereas I've often seen women do similar, and it is not seen that way. It's seen as you overshared, that's not something that, nice girls would reveal, or they're ostracized. I think it's part of gender bias that's out there, but I think it's one of the struggles to figure out. First of all, I think you have to figure out what's right for you. And I think it's really important to, we all learned probably in our preaching and seminary classes that you're supposed to preach from scars, not wounds, and all of those things. That's all important. Right. But I still think that even when you've done the work, even when you are in a place of health and balance, and you are holding a part of yourself as a way for someone in your congregation, your community, your audience to connect a little deeper to Christ, it is often heard by people as inappropriate, unprofessional, or overly emotional. I mean, like, the same story can be told, and a woman is over emotional and a man is brave. And it's just something that is a challenge. And I think I'd be interested to hear what Nancy and Jenna have to say on that topic.
Jenna, you want to go first, because I want to talk about a different aspect of gender, but if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, Kim, it's funny, as you're talking, I'm sort of nodding and realizing I haven't experienced that myself from outside, but I've I've felt it as an internal check against what I'll say. So I work with a male rector, and there are times he tells these wonderful stories from the pulpit, and I think, God, I could never tell that. And it's not because any parishioner would respond in a certain way if I told it. It's just because I think as a woman, I couldn't stand there and say that. And so I think it's more of an internal awareness of that than anything I've actually experienced from someone else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a challenge for me to be a little more vulnerable in my preaching. I mean, I think I am, but in different sorts of ways, less with maybe disclosure. I don't know. That I haven't really thought about it, Kim, but it's I want to now.
Well, you know, I think you've probably all heard the phrase finding your voice. And I think each communicator is trying to find their voice. And when I first started, I was the first female teaching pastor at my former church. And I thought that my stories had to be similar to what the men were telling. So the men, you know, some of them were like high adventure people, and they're telling these stories about bungee jumping and, you know, all these amazing trips they took or whatever, or sports or all of that. And I'm like, okay, I got to tell those kind of stories. And what I learned is that, first of all, that's not authentic to me. That's not my life. And when I tell my story, even if it's a very simple story of a moment with a friend or with one of my kids or at the grocery store, whatever, if it is a story that impacted me personally and I tell it well, it will connect with people, and it expands completely the lens with which we look at the world. It's like all of a sudden, not that there is one female perspective, there is not, but a female is giving her life story or a piece of her story. And I think that's really meaningful because more than half of the people sitting out there are probably female, and they're hearing these male stories every week, you know, in most places. So I think it's a gift that we give when we are willing to open up a little bit of ourselves. And I want to say something about the emotional thing. I can get emotional in the pulpit. It's not uncommon. And one thing I celebrated is that the men on the team cried as much as I did in the pulpit. So I didn't feel alone in that, but it was a stress. Like I would think to myself, don't go there. Don't, you know, get messy cry up there and all that kind of stuff. And I think you learn over time, you know, how to navigate that a little bit better. But I think it's unfortunate that we kind of label women as the emotional communicators. Because I've seen a lot of guys who really are passionate and heartfelt and very emotional.
Can I say one other aspect about gender that I'm thinking about? I think in my own tradition, my own context, part of that internalized fear is a sense that often women preachers are not as intellectually or theologically rigorous as men, and there's almost this sense of like, well, if I'm just telling these stories, like, am I going to not be perceived as like doing the textual work and like knowing my stuff? And so for me, I think like when I really think about it, I think that's more of my fear around being a super narrative preacher, because I want like I want to be taken seriously, and I want to hang with the big guys, and I want to, you know, I take theology and rigor of that really seriously. And so I have this fear of being perceived. I think sometimes women, especially in the main line, are not perceived as that. And so I actively push back against that, whether that's fair or not.
That's good.
I don't think anybody would ever accuse you, Jenna, of not having done the work.
Well, no, but I mean, like, it's, you know,
because
it's something
I just know how
about
smart you are. You're one of the smartest people.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I appreciate all of you saying that. And I have so many things I want to say, but at the risk of mansplaining my own thought into this, I'm going to just avoid from saying anything. So I will go to, we do have some really interesting comments that were thrown in there, kind of audience questions. So you guys will see them on the screen, but Kim, maybe we'll start with you. Are there stories you hesitated to share, personal stories that have never been told, beloved, well-worn, biblical stories? When you think about kind of your art of, maybe I'm reading this as kind of personal, but also like biblical storytelling, things that you have tried to stay away from.
Stay away. I mean, I do think that there is something to be said about having distance from a personal story, having done the work so that you're not using your community as therapy, right? So I think I would hesitate to share something really painful that I'm going through right now.
Yeah.
And although I will say that I think it's important, you know, I was in the local church during 2014 during Ferguson, and there was a period that fall where it felt like every Saturday night something happened, another shooting, and you know, it kind of feels that way right now, right? And I would say that I did allow myself to speak into the current context, even though I hadn't figured out what to say. And I think that that's what pastors and preachers have to do now around, you know, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the injustice of the world. Even if we don't have it figured out and have all the perfect words and haven't completely vetted how we think about it, I think sharing the struggle, sharing that you're doing the work, but maybe don't have it exactly figured out, I think that's really important. So I would hesitate like really personal wounding stuff, but I do think that we should be doing speaking into, even when you haven't got it figured out, the stories that are happening in our world. I think from like things I avoid from the Bible story, I know I was doing, when I was working in corporate America, I led a Bible study over lunch for a homeless shelter, and there was lunch, and it was there. I led a study so that men could stay in the warm area longer if they were in the Bible study. They did it, and I made the mistake of letting them choose what book of the Bible that they wanted to work on, and they said they wanted to do the Revelation, or they wanted to do Proverbs, and I was like, there's no way I'm doing Revelation with this group. Proverbs, no problem. And I didn't realize how many times proverb refers to horse. Like the horse are referred, I just forgotten. And so I was the only woman with a bunch of men, and we were going through Proverbs and a lot of whore talk. And I thought, no, I'm never going to do this again. Never going to. And so I don't think I've preached on Proverbs since then. So I try to stay away from Proverbs.
Yeah. Wow. There you go. I wouldn't have hesitated. So you might be chomping at the bit to answer this, but I'm going to give the two of you a slightly different one that we just got. And so the question is this: have you ever told a story that you regretted? Like when you look in like the storytelling of weaving in a story, and actually to Kim's point, like I remember going through a divorce, like I preached on that way too soon to try to like go through my own stuff. And it was just like, I regretted, like, and maybe it was a fine sermon, but like, you know what? They didn't need to go through this with me. And so for y'all, like, I wonder, Nancy and Jenna, like, did you think about a story that maybe, to Kim's point, you wove into soon, or just wasn't fully baked, or what might it have been?
I think that I once spontaneously, this is so embarrassing, spontaneously, as I was helping to lead communion, I had been reflecting that day on the physical pain of Christ on the cross. And so I was giving some insight into some of the things that I had learned about that. And what I wanted to say was the only thing close that I've ever experienced was childbirth. And it was like, my point was, it was like 1/1000th of the pain, you know, on the cross or whatever. But somehow I got it turned around, and it made it sound like I thought childbirth was as bad as the cross or something. I didn't even know that was true till I came down to the front, and my friend's like, do you realize that you just kind of basically said that childbirth is as bad as the cross? And it's an example of, like, in the moment, like Jenna was talking about being prepared. Like, I just kind of went off, and that was a bad idea. So I still get teased about that.
That's funny. Oh man.
I don't think I've ever told a story I regretted, probably because of what I was talking about, like swinging so far the other way of being reticent. Something I often wonder about or have some ambivalence about is using stories in which other people are central, and the ethics of that, and you know, and I don't have a good answer for it. I try to really be thoughtful around that, but there have been a couple times where I've wanted to use stories, not even other people's stories, but just stories in which other people figure, and had to really and sometimes I've decided to tell it, and if possible have asked them, and other times I've decided not to tell it. But that for me is always one of the discernment questions where I feel like there's potential for regret.
I have a married couple friends who are both preachers, and when their kids do something, they fight over the illustration, like who's going to get to use that, you know. But of course, they always ask permission from their kids. But yeah, I hear you. It's tricky, even with close friends. You know, you've got to ask, you got to check.
Yeah.
I think part of the discernment too is, especially someone who's in a parish setting, you are privy to a lot of the stories that is happening in a congregation. And I mean, there have been times where I've preached something, it was not about someone, but they heard it, that it was about them. And I think sometimes that's another filter that the storyteller has to think about is, could this be if you know that you've got, 3 families going through major custody issues and it's ugly, a story about a custody issue is going to land on those people right differently. And I think that's, again, one of those discernment questions that you have to think, is this worth it? Does this distract from what I'm trying to do? And will it shed an unfair light on someone else? And honestly, the smaller your community is, the more you really have to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I work with kids a lot. And one of sort of the best parts of my job is doing formation with children. And often they'll say things that I think that will preach. And I've been known to, call a kid on Friday and say, hey, is it okay if I say what you said in Sunday school in my sermon and give you credit? Because, I want to honor that and not kind of have them feel used.
It's good.
Yeah. Yeah. And little kids, I mean, giving them agency too, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to wait till they're 15 or 16, right? Like, a 5-year-old can say, yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I did what I do every episode, which was I forgot to told you to do your hot sauce on this one. So we're gonna do 2 hot sauces for our final win, or our final one.
Oh no!
So what I have here is I have. And my friend Steve over at RFH will get mad, but it's Kahlua, something like that. So it's like 2 million Scoville, so it's pretty hot. And that's my 4th sauce. Kim, what was your 4th sauce that we skipped?
My 4th sauce is Lola's Fine Hot Sauce Trinidad Scorpion.
All right, take a bite.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry, continue. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to tell you that this one wasn't that hot either.
Oh, what?
It's more like a green chili based.
Okay.
It has tang to it. It was good.
Kim, what do you got for 4?
It was not hot.
All right, Nancy, sorry. What do you have for 4?
Okay. Well, first of all, medium wasn't medium, so that was already too spicy for me, but that's okay. So my last 2 are Asian King and Caribbean Jerk.
All right. So you have that Asian one real quick, and then Jenna, what do you have for number 4?
I've got hot. And then for number 5, I've got damn hot.
Damn hot. Hot.
Hot and
oh,
damn
man.
hot.
That was hot. I thought it was going to be. Hot and damn hot. And so for my 5th one, I'm actually branching out for this episode. Instead of doing a sauce, I'm doing a Carolina Reaper powder, which is exactly what it sounds like. So this could be brutal. And so I'm just going to sprinkle a heaping amount on. But Kim, while I do that, what do you have for your last sauce?
I have the aka miso.
Okay.
And,
great sauce.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It seemed kind of thick.
Yeah, it's thick, but it's, I would say, one of the most delicious sauces I've had out there. So, and then Nancy, we've got your last one, and then Jenna, you said damn hot. So why don't we all take a bite real quick, and then I'll ask us our final question of the night. Ooh, that's no joke. Okay, so the final question for our time together is this. Y'all are faith leaders and in different seats in different denominations, which I really appreciate about this night. Like, we're not all different groups of people that we have an opportunity to interact with, different spheres of influence. And so I wonder for you, as you would say, what would be any tips you would give to someone trying to grow as a storyteller, whether they're a preacher, whether they're a teacher, whether they're a CEO? What are some tips for storytelling? We touched on a few tonight, but what tips did you have? And so, Kim, unless that was too brutal, we're going to start with you.
That's good. I like that. But it is hot.
Yeah.
It's really hot. Like, I feel that in my nose.
Yeah, don't touch your eyes.
Okay. So I think Nancy mentioned it earlier, and I watch a lot of comedians, which I think is good, but I also think be careful because you're not a comedian. And I know a lot of preachers who want to be comedians. And one of the things I think is really interesting right now with storytelling is the role of story, how it's moved into the comic scene, right? It's not just about joke telling. There's a lot of narrative going on. There's some really fascinating crafting of almost like monologue, one woman, one man show type things, which I think is amazing. So I think to grow as a storyteller, you've got to be reading and watching other storytellers. I think comedians are a good one, but I think you got to read deeply. I think you got to read fiction, not just, your systematic theology and your biblical interpretation textbooks. I think you need to be reading fiction. So I have a lot of saliva in my mouth right now. Yeah, it's working overdrive. I'm sorry if it's a good thing I'm not with you all. I'm like spitting.
No,
I'm watching my face get shinier and shinier from sweat.
Yeah, stay away from your eyes. Be careful. Nancy, what about you? What are your thoughts on tips for storytelling and storytellers?
Well, I agree with the reading for sure. And I would add to the fiction, nonfiction too. I mean, like history and stories. I just finished the book about Winston Churchill, Splendid and the Vile. It's just a fabulous book. So reading is big. I would also say, especially if you really want to develop in this area and maybe you're aware that you have a lot of growth to do, is see if you can find a coach, somebody who will watch your messages with you, who will give you feedback, who will stop it and say, okay, did you see there how you rushed that part, or how, you were so buried in your notes that we couldn't see your eyes and we didn't connect with you. Whatever. I have found that I've had some coaches in my life and they've made a huge difference. And then I've been able to offer that to some other people. And it's just another set of eyes. And, evaluation is controversial. Some people are like, we shouldn't, it's not a show. And I agree it's not a show. But if you want to grow as a communicator, you want to say, are my skills getting better so that whatever the message is that I'm trying to get across, there won't be anything in the way of that, and it'll be as strong as it can be.
Yeah, it's great. Jenna, why don't you bring us home? What do you think?
Two things come to mind. One is sort of specific to faith, to Christian storytelling, which is to immerse yourself in Scripture. I know Kim said you have to read other things, and I totally agree. And to kind of get fluent in the language of signs and images and kind of shared stuff we have as a body of Christ. I think that's how stories get richer and more layered, is when we kind of draw on that shared imagery and those shared signs. And then tips to grow as a storyteller. I don't know. For me, it's like thinking about the people I know who are great storytellers and how do they do it? Listen to them. Listening to, and I don't even mean like comedians, or I just mean like my friends who you know, the people who you always want to hear them tell that story because they do it so well. Pay attention to how they structure things, how they time things. And then learning to do that in your own voice and your own idiom.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's a tip, but I think just something to be thinking about. You know, how do I, again, maybe I'm kind of hung up on translation and interpretation tonight, but how do I translate into my own voice, my own way of embodying my own story and God's story? And there's a comfort piece to that, I think, kind of getting comfortable in your own skin, in your own voice, in your own particularity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a hard thing too. Like, I mean, like I've had an opportunity to work with really great preachers and like hear really great preachers, and like your natural like inclination is I want to be that person. And right. I think being able to figure out like how do you become the voice that like God geared, like if we believe God created us in God's image, right? Like then, and we're the kind of, we're not producing the fruit, but we're bearing the fruit of that story wherever we are. Like we're able to be the person God created us to be, and that like is maybe an amazing key to that. So yeah, Jen, I really appreciate that. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Well, hey, so as we get prepared to go, we've gone through our gauntlet, we've gone through our questions, we've gone through our spices, and so I like to end just with a chance to say you get 30 seconds to kind of have your soapbox, and it could be about the topic, it could be about anything. And so before we go, just 30 seconds are yours to promote, to speak to say whatever you like. And so Kim, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, first of all,
I for this either. So.
First of all, I would just say I'm personal friends with both of these women, so I'm so excited that I got to spend the evening eating hot wings and just catching up with them because I think they're brilliant, and so I'm so excited. And two great storytellers. So if you get a chance to hear either one of them preach or teach, you should really take advantage of it. I would say one of the things I'm kind of excited that I'm working on right now is something that I think is kind of relevant. I have a background in media, and specifically media literacy. And we live in a world right now where digital media, digital religion is kind of it, right? Like we're kind of living in that way, and discovering that a lot of adults don't have literacy around digital media and media in general. And so I'm working right now with a professor from the School of Journalism at Mizzou to develop kind of media literacy for faithful people. And so what does that mean to equip our congregations with the tools that you would need to really understand the media, how it works, and to investigate whether or not the sources that you seem to be using or that you're working through or reading or consuming on a daily basis are legitimate news sources. And so I'm kind of excited about that. So that's to come. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Nancy, what about you?
Well, to anyone who's either preparing, even if it's a short part of a worship gathering, like a hosting section or a scripture section, but particularly if you're doing the message time, I want to just urge you to be intentional about it and to protect the time you have to prepare that. If you think of it like you're preparing a meal for people, and it's not the whole reason that we gather. It's you know, sometimes we blow it up bigger than it should be, but it really does matter. And I think many of you have gobs of responsibilities and so many other things that interfere with preparation time. So know the best time of your day, when you're most creative and when you are, you know, most alive, and protect that time as an appointment for working on what you're going to, you know, give, what message you're going to give, including the research and including the walking around with ideas and the, you know, watching stuff and reading. And then you can prepare something that you say, this is a feast that God enabled me to prepare for you. And I feel like I can walk into it with confidence that He is with me and that His Holy Spirit will do what only the Holy Spirit can do, but will anoint what I have been led to prepare, instead of winging it, which some people are kind of good at, but there isn't, you can tell there just isn't the depth And their whole week got hijacked by all the other urgent things. So I just want to urge you to prize and prioritize the time that you have for preparing.
Yeah.
True.
Nancy, on a Thursday night, that's the word I needed to hear as I'm getting ready to
Everybody's like signing off right now.
We're dropping like flies.
I heard there's a website for pastors. It's something about it's Saturday night.
Saturday night.
Last minute.
That's funny.
I mean, that's actually related to what I wanted to say. So after thinking about this all week, kind of preparing for tonight, y'all have inspired me. This Sunday, I'm going to preach kind of a testimony, which is not what I usually do. And so y'all have really, the anniversary of my baptism, and so it's the text I heard at my baptism. I was an adult when I was baptized, and so I'm going to just tell that story a little bit, and hopefully do it using all the kind of good ways we talked about tonight. But y'all have inspired me, so thank you. And it's just been such a treat to be with you all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate just the three of you doing this and coming on. And friends, this is our second to last episode of what will now be our first season. We weren't sure how long we'd go on a run, but we have our next episode, which will wrap it up, which is volume 11, which we have 4 United Methodist bishops from across the country that are going to gather together and talk about, it's a lot of bishops in one room. And we're going to talk about leading a movement to the future. I would say I'm the bishop of hot sauce, but I don't think they would receive that well. And so I'll probably just say that to you guys.
Is it a mass of bishops? What's the name for a group of bishops?
Yeah, like a gaggle, a murder of bishops. What is it?
Oh, I hope it's not that one.
I like a mass.
I think a mass makes sense. I mean, friends in Hot Thoughts, why don't you help us come up with that? Figure out what it's going to be for next week. Figure out what we call this. This might be the first time, other than General Conference, that they've all been gathered together. They're gathered in a clump, right? And so, but friends, I thank you for doing this. Those that are watching, we can't wait to see you again next week. And if you missed some of it or all of it, or you just turned in, make sure you go to Hot Thoughts on YouTube. You can find this episode and all of them, and stay tuned because we actually have some really exciting things coming out this week that I can't share yet, but go to Hot Thoughts, the community group, find them. We'll drop them out through the week. But the three of you, thank you for being with us, and we can't wait to see everyone back next week.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Danny.
Yeah.